I think when somebody shows you who they are, you believe them. If somebody tells you what they're going to do and who they are, you believe them. And if they take those words, commit them to paper, sign their name beside it, and publish it to the whole world, then I think you should believe them. And so what I'm doing for myself, and again, my opinion, I am choosing to believe the words in Mark Carney's book because it was far enough away from the election, about 5 years ago that he was writing it, that it wouldn't be possible for him to simply tailor the book in order to use it as propaganda for this election with these set of facts that are going on currently right now. So if that were the case, I think he would have written some different things in his book for sure. So I think that the book is a good representation about what you could expect to get. For me, I'm going to choose to believe Prime Minister Carney's words in his book. And I take those over the words in his campaign. When I feel like I have to choose one or the other, and they're coming from the same person, that's generally a check mark on the bad side of the ledger for me, because trust and accountability are big things. So I would say Mark Carney's book is actually a gift to us, especially when looking back at those commercials 10 years ago. We really didn't know what was in the head of Justin Trudeau. We do now, and it appears to be very similar to what's in the head of Mark Carney. And just to go through the book just a little bit, I mean, the first 130 pages or so, I think 200 pages, is about economic theory, the history of value theory and how it's changed through time immemorial. It's not Mark Carney's own words. I mean, his own words are in there, but largely these pages could have been summarized, I think, in probably 4 pages, because this isn't new information. It's information from history. And for that reason, it read quite a lot like a textbook to me, a university economics textbook. And then sprinkled in there was the history of the Magna Carta and how that is involved with today's politics and the rise and fall of the gold standard. So as you can see so far, that does sound like a university textbook. And then next, the COVID crisis, and he also talks about the big economic crisis and the role that banks had to play in that and how that can protect people. And he also talks about Bitcoin and the 3 different kinds of cryptocurrencies and tells you what his favorite one is in there as well. So first of all, the premise of the book uses the words value as it's defined in terms of economics. And then he also uses the term values, which would refer to our intrinsic values, maybe like loyalty or things like health. So what his premise seems to be is that as theories of value have arisen over time and developed, our intrinsic values have eroded or have become somewhat interchangeable with actual value, like a price tag. So the long and the short of it is, if it doesn't have a price tag attached to it, then it doesn't have value. Basically talking about erosion of basic morality. What he also seems to be talking about is that this problem could be fixed by using the market itself to correct the problem, by putting political technology, private investment, and public investment, and incentives and disincentives to get the right people with the right values being financed and getting the benefits in society, while the other ones are going to have to suffer some pain for a while during the transition. And from what I can tell, he didn't seem to think that the transition risks associated with the changeover to green energy from our current energy sources would cause much risk to Canada. His book is all about reaching net zero. So with net zero, there comes a lot of control with the government. And that's one of the things that I think is most concerning about the Liberals. How my personal freedoms are going to be treated. I get the sense that he would be open to legislating morality, which I would find to be a huge infringement to personal freedom. I don't care if a person leans left, right, upside down, inside out. It's dangerous, no matter who you are, if your personal freedoms are taken away. Because once they're gone, you can never guarantee who's going to be in power next, and those same freedoms are gone. And then there'll be somebody telling you what morality they would like to legislate against you. And that's what I'm afraid of. The language that I didn't like there when he's talking about legislating different values and using political technology to do that. The term political technology bothered me because it was quite vague. And so if you're using political technology, I'd like to know what kind of political technology that would be. He also makes the statement too that it's basically like a muscle, that the more we use and flex these values, that the more we'll get used to it and then we'll get better and better at it. So basically, after a while, we'll just get used to it, is my impression of it. And I could be wrong. I'm open to other opinions of it too, but that's kind of my takeaway from it, is that people aren't capable of making good decisions anymore, if they ever were, on their own. So the government needs to step in and use the market, use banking, use investments, use incentives and disincentives to manipulate the market really in favor of certain moral values, and letting the market kind of dictate your values or legislate your values. I also tend to think when people are doing well, when they're not in survival mode, that that's when they have the greatest capacity to look outward and help other people. If you're trying to survive, trying to get food on the table, or if it's really, really hard to afford where you live or even to find a place to live, chances are you're not going to be happy when there are sanctions against you with respect to the environment when you didn't ask for it. I am for the environment. I'm for clean water, clean air. I have children. I live in this world and I breathe in this world. But I don't necessarily think that Mark Carney's plan was the one to go with, or if it was very, very premature at the time. For me, it didn't make sense to put the carbon tax in there because I think, first off, nobody's really fond of the game where the government takes your money without you being able to say no. They get to hold on to it for a while, and then they give you back your own money, and you're supposed to be thankful for that. Also, I don't think people understood how getting carbon taxed was going to help the environment. I think at its core, it was supposed to incentivize people to make other choices. But again, at the end of the day, when people are busy, they're scraping by, trying to survive. I think that they just do what they naturally do. The carbon tax kind of came across to me as punishing a child for not making their bed when there wasn't a bed to make yet. Right. So we don't have the infrastructure in place yet. And there are ways that we can improve the world. I've heard Pierre Poilievre talk about that.
We've had direct formal requests for our natural gas from Japan, Greece, Germany, France, and I'm probably missing some others. National Bank said if we displaced half of the electricity demand that India will have added to its grid over the next 20 years, by supplying our natural gas instead of them using coal, it would reduce global emissions by 2.5 billion tons, which is 3 times the emissions of all of Canada. So in other words, by exporting our gas, which is half as emissions intensive as coal, we could do far more than we could even do if we shut our entire economy down and disappeared from the earth.
So for me, I'm like, can we do that? Let's try that. It seems like we're given the choice of either making money and being financially secure or caring about the environment. And I believe 2 things can be true at the same time. And when I hear Pierre Poilievre talk about how we can still sell our natural resources, keeping us strong, keeping us free, that feels more comforting to me than talking about transition risks and keeping a lot of our hydrocarbons in the ground before we have the appropriate infrastructure and technology to replace that. And for him to not see what the response was likely to be, and again, he wasn't the prime minister when it came out, but we know that he's also a fan of the carbon tax from his own words, from his own book that he wrote rather recently. When I got his book, I knew nothing about him. So I challenged myself to say, okay, you weren't a fan of the Trudeau government, but you don't know anything about him. Let's open the book. Let's be open about it. Let's see where we get to on that. So I did that. So the book being about values, I thought that maybe he could open with something that was super valuable to him, but had no price out. Because that, I think, would have exemplified what his book was supposed to be about. Instead, the first page, it was all about his first day as governor for the Bank of England. And it was about the opulence and the gold and the statues and the fineries, a lot of name dropping as well. I was disappointed as a first impression because I thought if the point of the book was supposed to be about values and how we can get to those in a great way that creates virtuous circles, whatever those are. Why open your book talking about opulence and the bank? If you wanted to sound like a crony, that's how you would open a book. So that was my impression. Sorry. So moving to solidarity, page 419, he says, for Canada, that means supporting people coast to coast. I think that there are people in various regions of Canada that don't feel like the Liberal government has been fair. Page 421 of his book, he said it's critical that all rules and codes and laws be seen to be treating people fairly across the board. There can't be one set of rules for elites and insiders and another set of rules for the rest. However, there are some questions about investment portfolios. And when somebody's been the architect of the banking system in Canada and abroad, there will be questions about how much power and unchecked power and advantage that person could gain by having a position as Prime Minister of Canada or head of state. I had to read pretty far to get to these pages, and I hope you appreciate it. I read Mark Carney's book, so you don't have to. 424, resilience. That is where I found myself being a little cranky. He was talking about how government hasn't done a very good job of keeping Canada secure and safe. It's left it exposed to risks, and he was talking about that with respect to the COVID situation, and that there were a lot of shortfalls and shortcomings that were discovered while the COVID crisis was going on. He said that countries should be pursuing a more disciplined approach to building resilience so that countries can recover from shocks more quickly and they're not as vulnerable to shocks in the first place. He really does take some time in explaining all of the efforts that should be undertaken by a government to stress test and basically do your fire drills. And anything that can happen, make sure that you've planned for it. And things that you don't know can happen, plan for those too. And he says that plan beats no plan. And he said a more diverse system is a healthier system in terms of economy. He says systemic risks tend to punish mono strategies. So if we put that into the strategy that he was proposing, it's a strategy of green energy. But in terms of what's happening right now with trade tariffs and trade wars and uncertainty, it makes sense to have a diversified portfolio. And as an investor, he should know that. I do know by Mark Carney's own words in his book that he was aware that that was a situation that existed, talked about deglobalization and our intricate partnerships with the United States, our intimate relationship and entanglements with the United States and dependencies that the government has been failing and leaving us to be essentially vulnerable. What was the plan there? And whether you were there 1 year or 5 years, it sounds like it was in your mind. So I don't understand how this came as a surprise at this time. Sure, we can play the devil's advocate on that one too. Can say, but Bobby, there was a trade agreement in place. Surely they should be able to rely on that. Yes, but sometimes people break trade agreements. And Donald Trump is famous for saying things out loud long before he does them. So he had been threatening them for a long time. I feel like resilience has been ignored in favor of ideology that we weren't ready for. And these are costly mistakes to make. Bringing me to the next point of sustainability, which in his book, Mr. Carney defines sustainable development as meeting the current generation's needs without compromising future generations' abilities to meet their own needs. He's speaking about it with a backdrop of climate change and reaching net zero. However, when I read that definition, the first thing, the obvious thing that pops into my mind is our enormous debt. I don't believe that the previous administration was meeting the needs of the current generation, and having a debt like that is depriving future generations of the ability to meet their own needs. Without sustainability, without resilience, we have to remember those two are so important, because without the two of those, none of the rest matters, because we can't protect ourselves from outside forces. If we can't protect ourselves and if we don't have sovereignty, then we can't do all of these other things. We would be at the mercy of somebody else. And that's not fear mongering. It's saying if we're very, very economically dependent or interdependent, then there will be a consequence for that if situations change. And situations have changed. And then you ask yourself, was that foreseeable? Was there a plan? And Are we resilient to that? And I think the answer here is we definitely weren't all that resilient. I'll just quickly skip into dynamism. Dynamism he spoke of as we need to be more dynamic. We need new firms, new innovations, that we're not very resilient to shocks, and we've been harmed. Talks about new firms, new ideas taking over the old. I don't have a problem with that. I just have to see the ideas before the old are replaced. And by the way, Mr. Carney says that dynamism is most efficient if it's channeled through the market system so that you can get your social values put through the market system. And that's how the changes will happen the best. So your social values will be determined by somebody that's not you, and they will be put into the market system that will affect you. And then those will become your values, and that over time, if I'm understanding it correctly, it's like a muscle that if you use it, you'll just get used to it. And then maybe you'll forget about the fact that he's involved in every aspect of your life. I don't know. Page 445, social cohesion is the new competitiveness. If you read that back, that means fitting in socially has value. And I think if you've ever watched the Black Mirror episode where there is a social credit score that people are walking around with, and it would determine whether you're invited places, whether you get jobs, what kind of service you get at restaurants, all of that kind of stuff, and who would date you, that kind of thing, because value was given to values. That's something that a person could be concerned about. And if you want to know how Mr. Carney feels about sovereignty, he starts talking about it at page 454 in his book. And he said that it's actually in the context of a trade war, saying that often we think you cede sovereignty in order to join larger markets, or you take it back in times of trade wars. And he said that is such, I'm going to quote him here because he said, true patriotism is the opposite of such egotistical nationalism. But I am noticing just a wee little bit of some nationalism. He even goes on to say history shows us how easy it is to turn nationalism into something dangerous. So you can see that right at page 455, if you go and look. So he acknowledges how easy it is to use the concept of nationalism to forward your own ideals. I keep finding examples of hypocrisy, and they keep adding up. Another place where he was talking about sovereignty, Mr. Carney says that it is all too easy to confuse independence with sovereignty. So to me, it sounds like he could be slippery with that definition. I don't know that for a fact, but it sounds like he's saying, okay, well, we can still be sovereign without being independent. We can still have interdependence, is what I'm guessing what he's saying. He said, and I think he's quoting somebody here, but he says, true sovereignty is not making laws, but the ability to control outcomes and respond to the future needs of the people. And so in that respect, I think if we are left without a strong economic plan and a way to get out of the debt, then we're going to lose the ability to control outcomes and to meet the needs of our people. So we need to be really, really careful of ceding sovereignty or ceding independence. We have to be careful of how that looks, particularly with some of the comments that have been flying around down south, if you know what I mean. I don't see humility there either. I mean, there would be humility in removing a carbon tax that you were attached to. However, what it's coming across as right now, because it's in a campaign, is hypocrisy. I don't believe, and again, it's my opinion, I don't believe that the carbon tax would be removed if it wasn't a campaign. Humility would be admitting that you were advising during the Trudeau administration and that you got some things wrong, but here's how you're going to get them right. I would trust that. All right, I've taken the opportunity to look at what Mark Carney said in his own words. I don't think they stack up with the reality of Canada. I think the timing of a lot of his plans are premature, and that he has lacked the foresight to know that and to know how that would be received by the greater Canadian public. So that doesn't give me a lot of confidence. I also don't see a lot of consistency between the campaign and between the book. So that's not doing a lot for my trust on that end. At the end of all that, my hot take would be, if you want this circus to continue, probably best to have a Carney. I'm Bobby Joe. Talk to you soon.